The torches burned low against the stone walls of Babylon. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant, terrifying sound of roaring. Deep below the palace courtyard was a place few people ever wanted to see, and no one ever wanted to enter. The lion's den. It was not just a prison. It was an execution. Anyone thrown inside would not come back alive. The lions had been kept hungry. Their massive bodies paced through the darkness, their golden eyes glowing in the torchlight like living fire. Their growls echoed against the stone walls, sending chills through every soldier who stood guard nearby. And tonight, someone was about to be thrown into that pit. But this was not a criminal. This was not a traitor. This was a man known throughout the empire for wisdom, honesty, and unwavering loyalty. His name was Daniel. And even the king did not want this to happen. King Darius stood near the edge of the pit, his face pale under the flickering flames of the torches. His royal robe hung heavily over his shoulders, but tonight it felt like a burden rather than a symbol of power. Because for the first time since becoming king, he was powerless. His own law had trapped him. The soldiers stepped forward, holding Daniel by the arms. The old man did not resist. His face was calm, almost peaceful, as if he were walking towards something he had already accepted. Around them, the king's advisors watched closely, some with curiosity, some with cold satisfaction, because this had been their plan all along. They had tried to destroy Daniel many times before. They searched for corruption in his work. They examined every decision he made in government. They listened carefully to every word he spoke. But they could find nothing. Daniel was honest. Daniel was loyal. Daniel could not be corrupted, and that made him dangerous. So they did something far more clever. They turned his faith into a trap. They convinced the king to pass a new law, one that sounded harmless at first. For 30 days, no one in the entire empire could pray to any god or ask anything from anyone, except the king. Anyone who broke this law would be thrown into the lion's den. The king had signed the decree proudly, thinking it would unite the empire and strengthen loyalty to the throne. But he had not realized what it meant for Daniel. Because Daniel prayed every day, 3 times a day, and everyone knew it. The advisors waited. They knew Daniel would never stop. And they were right. Daniel did exactly what he had always done. He went home. He opened his window toward Jerusalem. He knelt down, and he prayed, not in secret, not in fear, but openly, faithfully, as he had done his entire life. And when the spies saw it, they rushed to the king. Now the law could not be undone, not even by the king himself, because the law of the Medes and Persians could never be changed. And so now, the man the king trusted most was about to die because of a law the king himself had signed. King Darius looked at Daniel with deep sorrow in his eyes. He had spent the entire day searching for a way out, but there was none. The law was final. The punishment was certain. The soldiers moved Daniel closer to the edge of the pit. The roar of the lions grew louder. The ground trembled slightly as the massive animals moved below. One of the soldiers lifted the heavy stone that covered the entrance. A terrible sound rose from the darkness beneath. The lions knew something was coming. The king stepped forward one last time, his voice trembling. "Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." It was not a command. It was a hope, a desperate hope. Daniel nodded quietly. There was no fear in his eyes, only trust. Then the soldiers released him. Daniel disappeared into the darkness below. The stone was rolled back into place. The lions roared, and the king walked away in silence, knowing that the man he respected more than anyone else in the kingdom was now trapped in a pit with starving beasts. That night, the palace was quiet, but the king could not sleep. He refused music. He refused food. He paced the floors of the palace again and again, because somewhere in the darkness of that den, a faithful man was waiting, and no one knew if he would survive the night. But what no one in the empire knew yet was that something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would shake an entire kingdom. Because the lions were not the real test that night. Faith was, and before the sun rose over Babylon, the world would witness a miracle no one would ever forget. The road to Babylon was long, dusty, and filled with the sound of chains. For the young men taken from Jerusalem, every step away from home felt like a piece of their identity being stripped away. The temple was gone. Their king was gone. Their land was behind them. And now they were walking toward the most powerful empire on earth. Among them was a young man named Daniel. He was not the strongest. He was not the loudest, but there was something about him that set him apart. A quiet steadiness, a kind of calm that didn't make sense for someone whose entire world had just collapsed. Because while Babylon had taken Daniel's home, it had not taken his faith. The strategy of Babylon. When the captives finally arrived in Babylon, they were brought before the officials of the king. But instead of chains and labor camps, something unexpected happened. The king had a plan. Babylon did not only conquer nations with swords, it conquered them with culture. The brightest young men from Judah were selected and brought into the king's palace. They would be educated in the language of Babylon. They would study Babylonian literature. They would learn Babylonian science, astrology, politics, and philosophy. And after 3 years of training, they would serve the king himself. Daniel was among those chosen. From the outside, it looked like an honor. But in reality, it was something far more dangerous. It was assimilation. Babylon wasn't trying to destroy these young men. Babylon was trying to remake them. The first thing Babylon took from them was their names. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. These names carried meaning. They carried history. Each name honored the God of Israel. But Babylon erased them. Daniel became Belteshazzar. Hananiah became Shadrach. Mishael became Meshach. Azariah became Abednego. Their new names honored Babylonian gods. It was subtle, but it was strategic. If you can change someone's name, you can slowly change their identity. If you can change their identity, you can change their loyalty. And if you can change their loyalty, you can control their future. Babylon understood something many people still don't realize today. The greatest battles are not fought on battlefields. They are fought inside identity. The table of the king. Then came the next test. The king ordered that these young men be given food from the royal table. The best meat, the best wine, the best everything. It was luxury, privilege, honor. For most captives, it would have felt like winning the lottery. But Daniel saw something else. A trap. Because the food from the king's table had been offered to idols. To eat, it would mean quietly accepting Babylon's spiritual system. It would mean blending in, adapting, compromising. And Daniel made a decision that probably looked incredibly small at the time, but it would define the rest of his life. He refused. The quiet courage. Daniel did not protest loudly. He did not start a rebellion. He did not attack the system. Instead, he went to the official in charge and respectfully made a request. Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us only vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare us with the young men who eat the royal food. If we look worse, you can punish us. It was a bold request, because if Daniel looked weak after 10 days, he would be in serious trouble. The official hesitated. If the king discovered that the captives under his watch were weaker than the others, it could cost him his life. But Daniel's calm confidence convinced him to take the risk. 10 days. That was all Daniel asked. 10 days of obedience. 10 days of trust. 10 days of faith. The unexpected outcome. At the end of the 10 days, something surprising happened. Daniel and his friends looked healthier than all the others. Their faces were brighter. Their bodies stronger. Their minds sharper. It made no sense from a Babylonian perspective, but the message was clear. God honored their faithfulness. So the official allowed them to continue their diet. And quietly, without anyone realizing it yet, Daniel had already won his first battle in Babylon. Not a battle with swords. A battle with compromise. The wisdom that couldn't be explained. Over the next 3 years, Daniel and his friends studied everything Babylon had to offer. Languages, astronomy, mathematics, government, history, magic traditions, dream interpretation. But something strange kept happening. No matter what subject they studied, Daniel and his friends kept excelling beyond everyone else. When the final day came and they were presented before the king, the result shocked the entire court. The king questioned them personally. He tested their knowledge. He challenged their thinking. And when the examination was finished, the king made a shocking declaration. Daniel and his friends were 10 times wiser than all the magicians and enchanters in the entire kingdom. 10 times. Not slightly better. Not competitive. 10 times. It was impossible to ignore. Something different was happening with these young men. Something Babylon couldn't fully explain. The real reason. The truth was simple. Daniel did not gain wisdom because he rejected Babylon. He gained wisdom because he stayed connected to God while living inside Babylon. This is what made Daniel so extraordinary. He did not run away from culture. He lived inside it without letting it change him. He learned everything Babylon taught. But his loyalty never moved. His identity never shifted. His faith never bent. And because of that, God began positioning Daniel in places no captive had ever been before. The quiet rise. What started as a group of exiles being trained in the palace was slowly becoming something far bigger. Daniel was not just surviving Babylon. He was rising inside it. And the empire didn't even realize what was happening yet. Because God had placed someone inside the system who could not be corrupted by it. Someone who could not be manipulated by power. Someone who could not be intimidated by kings. But that rise would soon attract attention. Dangerous attention. Because when someone walks with integrity in a corrupt system, they become a threat. And the higher Daniel climbed, the more enemies he would create. The lion's den had not appeared yet, but the forces that would send him there were already beginning to move. Years passed in Babylon. Empires rise slowly, but the careers of men can rise even faster. Daniel had arrived as a captive, a teenager with no power, no influence, and no control over his future. But time has a strange way of revealing character, and character has a strange way of opening doors. What began as a training program for exiles slowly turned into something much bigger. Daniel was no longer just another student in the king's academy. He had become something rare in the Babylonian court. Someone trusted. The difference everyone noticed. In a palace filled with ambition, politics, and competition, Daniel stood out in a way that was impossible to ignore. Not because he chased power, but because he didn't. Most officials in the empire were constantly maneuvering for influence, whispering behind doors, manipulating situations, trying to impress the king. But Daniel operated differently. He worked faithfully. He spoke wisely. And when others exaggerated their accomplishments, Daniel simply did his job with integrity. It made people uncomfortable, because excellence exposes mediocrity, and integrity exposes corruption. Over time, the difference between Daniel and the other officials became undeniable. The king began assigning him more responsibility, more influence, more authority, until eventually Daniel was placed over significant affairs of the kingdom. And that's when the problems began. The jealousy of the court. In royal courts, success rarely goes unnoticed, but it also rarely goes unresented. The other administrators and governors watched Daniel carefully. At first it was curiosity, then suspicion, then jealousy. How could a foreign exile rise higher than men born into Babylonian nobility? How could someone from a conquered nation gain more trust from the king than lifelong officials of the empire? It made no sense. And jealousy has a way of turning questions into accusations. So they began looking for something. Anything. A mistake. A scandal. A hidden weakness. Some flaw that would expose Daniel as unworthy. They reviewed financial records. They studied his decisions. They examined the systems he managed. But no matter how hard they searched, they found nothing. Daniel was honest. He was disciplined. He was responsible. There was no corruption. No negligence. No scandal. The records were clean. The decisions were wise. The results were undeniable. And this frustrated them even more. Because if they couldn't destroy Daniel through his work, they would have to find another way. The real source of the problem. Eventually they realized something. The only unusual thing about Daniel wasn't his administration. It was his faith. Daniel prayed every day. 3 times a day. Morning, afternoon, night. And he didn't hide it. He would open the windows of his room, facing Jerusalem, and pray to the God of Israel. Every single day. Not quietly. Not secretly. Openly. Publicly. Consistently. It was a habit he had practiced since his youth. Through exile. Through palace life. Through promotions. Through pressure. Daniel had never stopped praying. And suddenly the jealous officials realized something. They had finally found the one place Daniel would never compromise. His relationship with God. And if they could turn that faith into a crime, they could finally destroy him. The trap begins. But Daniel was too respected to accuse directly. If they went to the king with personal complaints, it would look like petty jealousy. They needed something bigger. Something political. Something that would force the king to act even if he didn't want to. So they designed a trap. A brilliant one. They approached the king with flattery. King Darius, live forever. Your kingdom is strong and united. But to strengthen loyalty even more, we have an idea. They proposed a law. For 30 days, no one in the entire empire could pray to any god or ask any petition from anyone except the king. Anyone who broke the law would be thrown into the lion's den. To the officials, it sounded perfect. To the king, it sounded like loyalty. For 30 days, the entire empire would recognize him as the ultimate authority. And according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, once a decree was signed, it could never be changed, even by the king himself. So King Darius signed it. Just like that. With one signature, Daniel's faith had been turned into a crime. The moment of decision. News of the decree spread quickly through the palace. Officials whispered. Servants carried rumors. Everyone knew what the law meant. Everyone knew who it targeted. Daniel. Now the trap was set, and all eyes quietly turned toward one question. What would Daniel do? Would he stop praying for 30 days? Would he close the windows? Would he pray in secret? Would he adjust his routine just enough to survive? From a practical standpoint, that would have made perfect sense. 30 days is not a long time. God would understand. Safety would be reasonable. But Daniel saw the situation differently. Because compromise rarely stays small. If you bend once under pressure, the next time becomes easier. And the next. And the next. Soon the identity you protected for years quietly disappears. Daniel had lived in Babylon for decades. Kings had come and gone. Empires had shifted. But one thing had remained constant. His devotion to God. And he wasn't about to change that now. The same window. So Daniel did exactly what he had always done. He went to his room. He opened the windows toward Jerusalem. He knelt down. And he prayed. Morning, afternoon, night. Just like always. No rebellion. No announcement. No speech. Just quiet faithfulness. The same routine he had practiced for years. But this time, someone was watching. Actually, several people were watching. The officials who had designed the trap were already waiting outside. And the moment Daniel began praying, they had the evidence they needed. The arrest. They rushed back to the king immediately. But they didn't start with Daniel. They started with the law. Your Majesty, didn't you sign a decree that anyone who prays to any god or man except you for 30 days must be thrown into the lion's den? The king nodded. Yes, according to the law of the Medes and Persians. Then Daniel has broken the law. The moment the king heard Daniel's name, his heart sank. Because King Darius respected Daniel. He trusted him. He valued his wisdom. And suddenly he realized he had been manipulated. The law wasn't about loyalty to the king. It was about eliminating Daniel. But there was a problem. The law had already been signed. And by tradition, it could not be revoked. Even by the king. The king's desperate effort. All day long, King Darius searched for a way to save Daniel. He studied legal loopholes. He questioned advisors. He examined the decree from every angle. But the officials who created the trap were careful. They kept reminding the king, Your Majesty, the law of the Medes and Persians cannot be changed. They knew time was on their side. Because by sunset, the sentence had to be carried out. And as the sun slowly lowered across the Babylonian sky, the reality became unavoidable. Daniel would have to face the lions. The strange calm. When the guards came for Daniel, there was no panic, no resistance, no argument. Daniel simply went with them. By now he was an old man. He had served kings. He had guided governments. He had survived decades in a foreign empire. And yet his life might end in a pit filled with hungry lions. But something about Daniel's calm unsettled everyone around him. Because he didn't look like a man walking toward death. He looked like a man who trusted something bigger than the moment. Even King Darius felt it. As Daniel was brought before the den, the king spoke words filled with hope and desperation. May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. It was not a command. It was a prayer. And with that, Daniel was lowered into the darkness. The lions moved below. The stone was rolled into place. The seal of the king was placed upon it. And the night began. But no one in Babylon would sleep peacefully that night. Because by morning, either Daniel would be dead, or something impossible would have happened. Daniel had lived long enough to understand something about power. It doesn't always corrupt people, but it almost always reveals them. And in the royal court of Babylon, power was revealing something dark inside the hearts of many officials. Jealousy. Not loud jealousy. Not obvious jealousy. But the quiet, calculating kind. The kind that smiles in meetings, while secretly planning someone's downfall. A man too difficult to defeat. Daniel had become one of the most respected administrators in the entire empire. Under King Darius, the kingdom was organized into provinces. Over those provinces were governors. And over the governors were 3 high officials. Daniel was one of those 3. But he wasn't just another administrator. He was the best of them. The scriptures say something remarkable about him. An excellent spirit was in him. That phrase meant more than intelligence, more than skill. It meant character, wisdom, discipline, integrity. Daniel handled responsibilities that affected thousands of lives. Taxes, law, government stability. Yet in every situation he remained fair, honest, careful, reliable. Soon the king began considering something extraordinary. He was thinking about placing Daniel over the entire kingdom, above all the governors, above all the officials, a foreign exile, overseeing the empire that had conquered his people. And when the other leaders realized what the king was planning, their jealousy turned into something much more dangerous. Fear, the secret investigation. They began watching Daniel. Quietly, carefully. Every report he filed was examined. Every decision he made was reviewed. They checked financial records. They interviewed servants. They monitored the systems he supervised. They were searching for anything. A mistake, a scandal, a bribe, some hidden corruption. But the deeper they looked, the more frustrated they became. Daniel was clean, painfully clean. There were no missing funds, no suspicious decisions, no evidence of dishonesty. He did his work so well that even his enemies couldn't accuse him. And that created a terrifying realization. They couldn't defeat Daniel through corruption, because Daniel wasn't corrupt. The dangerous discovery. Eventually one of them said something that changed everything. If we are going to find anything against this Daniel, it will have to be connected to the law of his God. The room fell silent, because suddenly they understood. Daniel's weakness wasn't in his work. It was in his faith. He worshipped the God of Israel. He prayed every day. Everyone in the palace knew it. And Daniel didn't hide it. 3 times a day he would kneel and pray. Morning, afternoon, evening. It didn't matter how busy the government was. It didn't matter what political pressure surrounded him. Prayer was the center of his life. The officials looked at each other. And slowly, a plan began forming, turning faith into a crime. If Daniel wouldn't compromise his faith, then they would make his faith illegal. But they couldn't simply accuse him of praying. Babylon was full of religions. Many gods were worshipped openly. They needed a law that would trap Daniel specifically. And so they created one of the most clever political traps in history. They gathered together and approached the king, not as individuals, but as a unified group. It was intentional, because when many voices speak together, it sounds like consensus, and consensus can influence a king. They bowed respectfully before King Darius. May the king live forever. Flattery was always a good way to begin. The proposal. Then they presented their idea. All the administrators, governors, advisors, and officials of the kingdom have agreed. That statement wasn't even true. Daniel had not agreed. But they said it anyway. That the king should establish a royal decree. For 30 days, no one in the entire empire could pray to any god or make any request of anyone except the king. Not a priest. Not a god. Not even a personal prayer. Only the king. For 30 days the king would be the sole authority for petitions, and anyone who disobeyed would be thrown into the lion's den. To the conspirators, it sounded like a perfect trap. But to King Darius, it sounded like loyalty. For 30 days the entire empire would acknowledge his authority. No rival gods. No divided loyalty. Just the king. And there was another detail they carefully included. The decree would be written according to the law of the Medes and Persians. And that law had a unique feature. Once it was signed, it could never be changed, not even by the king himself. The signature. King Darius considered the proposal. He probably thought it would strengthen unity. Perhaps he saw it as a temporary act of loyalty. Maybe he even believed it would improve order across the kingdom. But he did not see the trap. And so he signed it. One simple decision. One signature. And suddenly, Daniel's daily prayer life became illegal. The watchers, the conspirators wasted no time. They knew exactly what Daniel would do. He would pray, because Daniel had prayed every day for decades. They didn't need to wait long. They just needed to watch. So they positioned themselves carefully, near Daniel's residence, where they could see his window, because Daniel always opened the window toward Jerusalem. It was a small act of devotion, a reminder of home, a reminder of the God he served. And the conspirators waited, like hunters waiting for prey. The moment arrives. Soon the time came. Daniel entered his room. He opened the window, just as he had done for years. He knelt down. And he began to pray. He did not whisper. He did not hide. He did not look over his shoulder. He simply prayed, thanking God, seeking guidance, speaking with the one he trusted. Outside the window, the officials watched, and their plan succeeded. They had caught him. The accusation. They rushed immediately to the king. But again, they were careful. They did not begin with Daniel. They began with the law. Your Majesty, did you not sign a decree that anyone who prays to any god or man except you for 30 days must be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered confidently, yes, the decree stands according to the law of the Medes and Persians. That was the confirmation they needed. Then they delivered the accusation. Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, ignores you, Your Majesty. He still prays 3 times a day. The moment the king heard Daniel's name, his heart dropped, because suddenly he understood. This law was never about loyalty. It was about Daniel. He had been manipulated, used, trapped, but the law was already sealed, and the laws of the Medes and Persians could not be changed. The king's dilemma. King Darius spent the entire day trying to save Daniel. He searched for legal loopholes. He consulted advisors. He studied the decree. But every path ended the same way. The law was permanent, and the officials reminded him constantly, Your Majesty, remember, no decree established by the king can be changed. They said it again and again, pressuring him, waiting, watching the sun slowly move across the sky. Because when evening came, the sentence had to be carried out. Daniel's response. Meanwhile, Daniel did something remarkable. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He didn't try to defend himself. He already knew the outcome. The law was real. The punishment was real. But Daniel had made his decision long before the decree existed. His loyalty to God would not change, even if the price was his life. And when the guards finally came to take him, Daniel walked with them peacefully, not like a criminal, but like a man who trusted something bigger than the empire around him, something bigger than kings, something bigger than lions, something bigger than death itself. And the entire kingdom was about to discover what happens when human power collides with divine protection. The sun was beginning to fall behind the walls of Babylon when the order finally came. It was an order King Darius never wanted to give. Yet it was an order he could not escape. The law of the Medes and Persians was absolute. Once a decree had been signed with the king's seal, it became permanent. Not even the king himself had the authority to undo it. And now that law was about to cost him the one man he trusted most. Daniel, a king trapped by his own law. King Darius had spent the entire day trying to find a way out. He called advisors. He reviewed the decree. He asked legal experts. He searched for loopholes. But every answer came back the same. The law could not be changed. And the men who had designed the trap made sure to remind him. They stood in the court with quiet confidence. Waiting, watching, pressuring. Your Majesty, they said again and again. Remember, the law of the Medes and Persians cannot be revoked. The words sounded respectful, but underneath them was something darker. Control. They knew the king had no escape. And eventually Darius realized something painful. He had been manipulated. The law had never been about loyalty to the king. It had been about removing Daniel. And now the king himself had become part of the trap. The order is given. As evening approached, the officials returned. This time they did not ask questions. They demanded action. The decree had to be enforced before nightfall. The king sat silently on his throne. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on him. Finally, he spoke the words he never wanted to say. Bring Daniel. The room grew quiet. Guards were sent immediately. And soon Daniel was standing before the king. The final conversation. There was no anger in the king's eyes. Only regret. Darius looked at Daniel not as a criminal, but as a friend. A loyal servant. A man whose wisdom had strengthened the entire kingdom. And now that same man was about to be thrown into a pit of lions. Because of a law the king himself had signed. For a moment the king said nothing. Then he spoke words that revealed something remarkable. May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. It was not a command. It was not a decree. It was a hope. The most powerful man in the empire was now hoping in the God of the man he was about to execute. Because deep down Darius knew something. Daniel's faith was real. He had seen it for years. He had seen Daniel's discipline, his honesty, his calm spirit. This was not the faith of a man pretending. This was the faith of someone who truly believed. And now that belief was about to be tested in the most terrifying way imaginable. The lion's den. Outside the palace walls was a place everyone feared. The lion's den. It was not a small cage. It was a large pit carved into the earth. Stone walls surrounded it. At the bottom of the pit lived several lions. These lions were not pets. They were kept hungry, strong, violent. They were used as a method of execution. Anyone thrown into the den would not survive long. The guards led Daniel through the darkening streets. Torches flickered in the evening air. People whispered as they watched. Word had already spread across Babylon. Daniel, the respected governor, was about to die. Yet Daniel walked calmly. No panic, no resistance, just quiet steps forward. The edge of the pit. When they arrived at the den, the smell of the animals filled the air. Low growls echoed from below. The lions sensed movement. They were awake, hungry, restless. The guards tied Daniel's hands. Not roughly, but firmly. Then they brought him to the edge of the pit. For a moment Daniel looked down into the darkness. Several pairs of glowing eyes stared back at him. The lions were already circling, waiting. Behind him stood the officials who had arranged everything. They watched eagerly. Their plan had worked perfectly. Soon Daniel would be gone, and the position of power he held would finally be open. But Daniel did not look at them. Instead, he lifted his eyes toward the sky, and perhaps in that moment, he prayed one final prayer. The fall. The guards pushed him forward. Daniel disappeared into the darkness. For a moment there was silence. Then the sound of movement. The lions were active. But something strange happened. No scream. No sound of attack. No violent struggle. Only the quiet shifting of animals in the darkness. The officials frowned slightly. But it was already too late. The execution had been carried out. A large stone was rolled over the opening of the den. Then something even more significant happened. King Darius stepped forward. He pressed his royal seal onto the stone. Then the officials added their seals as well. The stone was now officially locked. No one could open it during the night. No one could interfere. The law had been fulfilled. Daniel was inside. The lions were inside. And the entire empire believed the outcome was certain. A sleepless night. The king returned to his palace. But he did not celebrate. He did not eat. He did not listen to music. In fact, the scriptures say he refused all entertainment that night. The palace servants tried to bring food. He refused it. Musicians offered to play. He dismissed them. The king could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined the den, the darkness, the lions. And Daniel. Had the lions attacked immediately? Had Daniel suffered? Was he still alive? The king walked the palace halls throughout the night. Restless, regretful, powerless. Because for the first time since becoming king, he could do nothing. Meanwhile, in the den, while the king struggled with fear above ground, something extraordinary was happening below. Inside the pit, in the darkness, where lions ruled, where no human could survive, where death was expected, Daniel was not alone. Because the story was never really about the lions. It was about the God Daniel served. The God who sees. The God who protects. The God who can enter places no human rescue can reach. And before the sun would rise again, Babylon was about to witness one of the most famous miracles in history. The night in the lion's den had only just begun. Night settled slowly over Babylon. The great city that usually pulsed with music, commerce, and conversation had grown quiet. Torches flickered along the palace walls, and the cool desert air moved through the streets like a whisper. Most people in the kingdom had already accepted what had happened. Daniel was gone. No one survived the lion's den. It was not merely a prison. It was a place where sentences ended. Yet while the city slept, two very different nights were unfolding. One above the ground, one below it. And the contrast between them would reveal something powerful about fear and faith. The king who could not sleep. Inside the palace, King Darius walked alone. His chamber was filled with luxury, soft fabrics, carved pillars, golden lamps, but none of it brought him peace. He had dismissed the musicians. He had refused food. Even the servants kept their distance, sensing the king's troubled spirit. Darius sat on the edge of his bed, staring into the darkness. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image. Daniel standing at the edge of the pit. The glow of the torches. The stones sealing the den. The king had ruled armies. He had commanded generals. He had conquered territories. But tonight he had discovered something humiliating. He was powerful enough to rule an empire, but not powerful enough to undo one law. And that law had taken the life of the one man he trusted most. Regret. The king replayed the moment in his mind. The officials entering the throne room. Their flattering words. Their proposal. How easily he had signed the decree. How confident he had felt. It had seemed harmless. 30 days. A show of loyalty. A simple political move. But now he understood. They had never cared about loyalty. They cared about removing Daniel. And the king had unknowingly helped them do it. The thought burned inside him. He rose again and paced the room. Outside the palace windows, the moon climbed slowly into the sky. But the king's mind refused to rest. Because somewhere beneath the earth, in a pit filled with lions, Daniel was facing a night no human should survive. Meanwhile, in the den, but something completely different was happening in the darkness below. The lion's den was cold. Stone walls surrounded the pit. The smell of animals filled the air. Low breathing echoed in the shadows. Massive shapes moved quietly across the ground. The lions were awake. Their eyes glowed in the darkness. They were hungry. They had been trained for moments like this. When someone was thrown into the den, the attack usually happened instantly. But tonight something strange had happened. The lions had approached Daniel, their powerful bodies circling him slowly, their breath heavy, their claws scraping softly against the stone. Yet they did not attack. Instead, something invisible had entered the den. Something the lions sensed immediately. The presence of God. The angel. The scriptures describe the moment simply. God sent his angel. Not a symbol. Not an idea. But a real messenger from heaven. And that angel did something extraordinary. He shut the lions' mouths. The predators that normally tore men apart were suddenly calm. Their aggression vanished. Their power restrained. The same lions that could crush bones with their jaws now sat quietly in the darkness. And in the middle of them stood Daniel. Alive. Unharmed. Protected. A knight of faith. Daniel did not panic. He did not scream. Instead, he remained calm. Because Daniel understood something many people forget when facing fear. God's protection does not always remove danger. Sometimes it simply enters the danger with you. The lions were still there. Their massive bodies lay across the stone floor. Their golden eyes reflected the moonlight filtering down through the opening above. But they were no longer a threat. The angel stood among them, guarding, watching, holding back the violence of nature itself. And Daniel knelt in the darkness. The same way he had knelt in his room earlier that day. He prayed, not out of desperation, but out of trust, because the same God who had listened to his prayers through the open window was now standing beside him in the lion's den. The longest night. Hours passed slowly. Above ground the king remained awake. Below ground Daniel remained protected. The city slept. But history was unfolding quietly in the darkness. The lions occasionally shifted, their tails flicking across the stone floor. One lay near Daniel. Another rested beside the wall. But none of them attacked. The angel's presence held them back like an invisible barrier. And Daniel waited, patiently, calmly, for morning, because he knew something important. Faith does not always stop the night from coming. But faith knows the night will not last forever. Morning always comes. Dawn approaches. Finally, the sky above Babylon began to lighten. The dark blue of night slowly softened into gray. Birds began to stir. The first hints of sunrise appeared on the horizon. Inside the palace, King Darius had not slept at all. The moment he saw the light of morning, he stood up immediately. There was only one place he wanted to go, the lion's den. He rushed through the palace corridors. Servants struggled to keep up with him. Guards followed quickly behind. The king moved faster than anyone had ever seen him move before. Because deep inside his heart, a small piece of hope still remained. Hope that somehow, Daniel's God had done something impossible. The race to the den. The king reached the lion's den just as the sun began rising over Babylon. The stone still covered the opening. The royal seals remained unbroken. Everything looked exactly as it had the night before. But the king's heart was racing. He approached the edge of the pit, and with a voice filled with fear and hope, he called down into the darkness. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? For a moment, there was silence. The guards waited. The officials watched. The king held his breath. And then, a voice answered from the darkness below. A voice calm, strong, alive. May the king live forever. And in that moment, everyone standing near the lion's den realized something impossible had happened. The sunrise over Babylon had never felt so tense. Golden light slowly spread across the city walls, touching the towers, the gates, and the courtyards of the palace. Merchants were beginning to open their shops. Soldiers were changing their watch shifts. Life in the empire was waking up. But at the lion's den, time seemed frozen. King Darius stood at the edge of the pit, his heart pounding. Moments earlier he had shouted into the darkness, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Everyone around him expected silence. That was how these executions always ended. But instead, a voice rose from the darkness below. Calm, strong, alive. May the king live forever. For a moment, no one moved. The guards looked at each other in shock. The officials who had accused Daniel felt the color drain from their faces, and the king's eyes widened in disbelief. Daniel was alive. The voice from the den. The king leaned closer to the opening of the pit. "Daniel," he shouted. And again the voice answered from below. "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The words echoed up from the darkness. Not a cry of fear, not the desperate voice of a wounded man, but the calm explanation of someone who had witnessed a miracle. King Darius felt a wave of relief rush through him. The man he respected more than anyone in the empire had survived the night. And not because of luck, not because the lions were weak, but because the God Daniel served had intervened. "The stone is removed." "Quick," the king commanded. "Lift the stone." The soldiers rushed forward. The seals were broken. The heavy stone that had covered the den through the night was slowly rolled away. As the opening widened, light poured down into the pit. For the first time since Daniel had been thrown inside, the people above could see what was happening below, and the sight stunned them. Daniel was standing there, completely unharmed. His clothes were not torn. His skin was not wounded. His posture was calm. And around him, the lions moved quietly across the floor of the den. Their powerful bodies were still there, their muscles still strong, their eyes still glowing with wild instinct. But none of them had attacked. The king's command. "Pull him out," the king ordered immediately. Ropes were lowered into the pit. Daniel grasped them firmly. The guards pulled together, lifting him slowly upward toward the opening. Everyone watched. Even the officials who had accused him could not look away. When Daniel finally reached the top and stepped onto the ground, the soldiers quickly examined him. Not a scratch, not a wound, not even the smallest injury. The scriptures describe it simply. Daniel was unharmed because he trusted in his God. That one sentence carried incredible power. The lions had not failed. God had protected. The mood changes. The atmosphere around the den changed instantly. The guards who had expected to see a dead man now stood before a living miracle. The king's sorrow turned into overwhelming joy. But the officials who had plotted against Daniel felt something very different. Fear. Because they understood something immediately. If Daniel had survived the lion's den, then their plan had completely failed. And worse than that, the king now knew the truth. They had manipulated him. They had abused the law. They had tried to destroy an innocent man. And now that innocent man stood alive beside the king. Justice arrives. King Darius turned toward the group of conspirators. The men who had crafted the trap. The men who had rushed to accuse Daniel. The men who had insisted the law must be obeyed. Now they stood silently, waiting. The king's voice became cold. "Bring those men who falsely accused Daniel." The guards moved immediately. The officials tried to protest. But the law they had used against Daniel now returned against them. They had demanded justice. And now justice had come. One by one they were seized. Not only the leaders of the conspiracy, but also their families. Because in ancient Persian law, entire households could be punished for treachery against the crown. The same den that had been prepared for Daniel was now waiting for them. The truth about the lions. The guards led the conspirators to the edge of the pit. Some begged. Some shouted. Some tried to blame others. But none of it mattered. The king gave the order, and they were thrown into the lion's den. This time the outcome was immediate. Before their bodies even reached the floor of the pit, the lions attacked. Their hunger returned instantly. Their power was undeniable. Bones were crushed. The roar of the lions echoed across the courtyard, and everyone watching understood something clearly. The miracle of the previous night had not happened because the lions were weak. It had happened because God had restrained them. The same lions that now destroyed the conspirators. had been completely powerless the night before. A public miracle. News spread through Babylon like wildfire. Daniel had survived the lion's den. The man who prayed to his God 3 times a day had been protected by that very God. The story moved through the streets, through the markets, through the soldiers' barracks. People whispered about angels, about miracles, about the God Daniel served. But the most powerful response came from the king himself. Because King Darius understood something important. If Daniel's God could shut the mouths of lions, then that God deserved the respect of the entire empire. And so the king prepared a new decree, one that would travel across every province, every language, every nation under his rule. A decree that would change how millions of people thought about God. The decree of the king. Soon messengers were sent throughout the empire carrying the king's official proclamation. The decree read, "I issue a command that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." This was not a small statement. This was the ruler of one of the most powerful empires in the world acknowledging the power of Daniel's God. And it happened because one man refused to stop praying. The legacy of faith. Daniel's life continued after that day. The scriptures say he prospered during the reign of King Darius and even into the reign of Cyrus the Persian. But the story of the lion's den became something far greater than a political moment. It became a symbol, a reminder, a testimony that faith can survive even the most dangerous situations. Because Daniel had faced a choice that many people still face today: compromise or remain faithful. He chose faith, and that choice changed an entire kingdom. But the story was not finished yet. Because beyond the miracle, there was still a deeper lesson, a truth about courage, about loyalty, about trusting God even when the outcome seems impossible. And that lesson would echo through history for thousands of years. The story of Daniel in the lion's den did not end with the sunrise. The miracle had already happened. Daniel had been lifted out of the pit. The conspirators who plotted against him had faced justice. And King Darius had declared to the entire empire that the God of Daniel was the living God. But the real power of this story is not just what happened that night in Babylon. The real power is what the story reveals about faith, courage, and loyalty to God. Because Daniel's victory did not begin in the lion's den. It began long before that. The real battle happened before the den. Most people focus on the lions, the danger, the miracle. But the most important moment in the story happened before Daniel was ever arrested. It happened the moment Daniel learned about the king's decree. He knew the consequences. He knew the law. He knew the trap. And yet he still walked into his house, opened the windows toward Jerusalem, knelt down, and prayed. That moment was the true test. Because many people are brave when miracles happen, but real faith appears before the miracle. Daniel did not pray because he knew he would survive. He prayed because his relationship with God mattered more than his safety. Faith is not always safe. Daniel's story also reminds us of something important. Faith does not always make life easier. Sometimes it makes life harder. Daniel did the right thing. He was honest. He served the king faithfully. Even his enemies admitted they could find no corruption in him. Yet despite all of that, he was still thrown into the lion's den. Why? Because the world does not always reward integrity. Sometimes doing what is right will place you directly in conflict with people who prefer lies, manipulation, or power. Daniel experienced that reality firsthand. But instead of changing who he was, he remained faithful. And that faithfulness became the reason God's power was revealed. God does not always prevent the den. Another powerful truth in this story is that God did not stop Daniel from being thrown into the den. God could have stopped the law. God could have exposed the conspiracy earlier. God could have prevented the entire situation. But he didn't. Instead, God allowed Daniel to go into the den, and then protected him inside it. This is one of the most mysterious parts of faith. Sometimes God removes the danger. Sometimes he walks with us through the danger. Daniel's story shows that God's presence is not limited by the circumstances around us. Even in the darkest place, even in the deepest pit, even when surrounded by lions, God is still there. Courage is often quiet. Daniel's courage also looks very different from what many people expect. There were no dramatic speeches, no shouting, No attempts to fight the soldiers. No panic when he was thrown into the den. Daniel's courage was quiet, steady, unshaken. He simply continued living the same life he had always lived. Praying, trusting, remaining faithful. True courage often looks like that. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a calm decision to remain faithful even when pressure rises. Daniel did not change his behavior because of fear. And that quiet courage became one of the most powerful testimonies in the entire Bible. One man's faith changed an empire. Think about the impact of Daniel's decision. Because one man refused to stop praying, a king witnessed the power of God. A miracle became known across an empire. A royal decree declared God's greatness. Generations would remember the story. Daniel probably never imagined how far his example would travel. But faith often works like that. Small decisions can create enormous impact. One person choosing integrity, one person choosing courage, one person choosing faithfulness can influence far more people than they realize. The lions in our lives. Today, most people will never face a literal lion's den. But the story still speaks to us because everyone faces moments that feel similar. Moments when doing the right thing is unpopular. Moments when pressure pushes us to compromise. Moments when fear whispers that faith is too risky. Those are the modern lion's dens. The question is not whether those moments will come. They always do. The real question is how we will respond when they arrive. Will we choose safety over faith? Or will we remain faithful the way Daniel did? The God who still saves. The final message of the story is simple but powerful. The God Daniel trusted is still the same God today. The same God who shut the mouths of lions. The same God who sent an angel into the den. The same God who turned a trap into a miracle. Daniel's story is not just ancient history. It is a reminder that God is still able to protect, guide, and rescue those who trust him. Not always in the way we expect. Not always on the timeline we want. But always with perfect wisdom and power. The story that never fades. Thousands of years have passed since that night in Babylon. Empires have risen and fallen. Kings have come and gone. Cities have turned to dust. But the story of Daniel in the lion's den still lives on. Parents tell it to their children. Teachers share it in classrooms. Preachers repeat it in churches. And every time it is told, it carries the same message. Faith is stronger than fear. Integrity is more powerful than corruption. And God is able to protect those who remain faithful to him. And so the story ends the way it began. With a man who simply refused to stop praying. A man who trusted God even when surrounded by lions. A man whose quiet faith changed the course of history. Because sometimes, the greatest miracles happen after the stone is rolled over the den. And sometimes, the darkest night becomes the moment when God's power shines the brightest.